I stopped counting winters after the fifth one. Not because they grew easier, no. That's a lie people tell themselves in the valley. I stopped because counting gave the cold a dignity it didn't deserve. Out here, where the land tilts upward toward the jagged teeth of the mountains, the cold doesn't roar. It doesn't threaten. It simply settles. It works its way into the grain of the wood and the marrow of your bone, with the agonizing patience of something that knows, with absolute mathematical certainty, that it will win eventually. The last stop in stood at the thinning edge of the world. It was a crooked, salt-bleached structure that felt less like a place of rest and more like a tombstone for ambition. The sign out front had been scoured smooth by years of wind, the letters long since surrendered to the gray. Most travelers passed it with their eyes fixed forward and their reins held tight, already imagining the warmth of the next town. I kept the place running because it was easier than letting it die. Because closing the door for the last time meant admitting that the fire in my own chest had finally gone out. By late winter, the traffic narrowed to a trickle of the desperate and the damned. Only those with no other choice rode when the snow refused to melt. I gave them water. I gave them a fire long enough to stop the shaking in their hands. And then I sent them back into the dark. No beds, no names, no staying the night. That was the rule. It was the wall I built to keep the ghosts of my past from claiming the few remaining corners of my mind. The day she arrived, the world was a study in silence. The snow was falling straight down, no wind, no drama, just a heavy white curtain that blurred the edges of reality until the porch railing seemed to float in a void. I was by the hearth, mending a chair leg with a dull rasp, when I felt the light shift. It wasn't a shadow. It was a displacement of the air. I looked up, and for a heartbeat, I thought the cold had finally taken my mind. She stood at the edge of the porch, one hand braced against a post, her head bowed as if she were listening to the earth move. She didn't knock. She didn't call out for mercy. She just stood there, her breath curling in faint, uneven plumes of steam. Then I saw her feet. That was the moment the breath left my lungs. She was barefoot. Her skin was a violent, raw red against the frozen boards, the toes beginning to take on that terrifying waxy sheen of the frost-killed. She wore a dress of thin, dark wool, torn at the hem, and a shawl that offered no more protection than a cobweb. I didn't move. Not at first. Out here, mercy is a currency that can bankrupt a man. People who make it this far in February usually want your soul. They come with hands out, voices cracked with practiced pleading. But this woman, she was different. She waited with a deliberate, agonizing strain in her posture. She looked like a woman who knew that if she moved too quickly, she would shatter into 1,000 shards of ice. I stood, my knees popping like dry tinder, and opened the door just enough to let a sliver of heat spill out. Her eyes lifted. They were dark, deep-set, and entirely devoid of hope. They were the eyes of someone who had already seen the end and found it wanting. "I don't need a bed," she said. Her voice was a jagged scrape of sound, thin and brittle, yet it didn't tremble. Just the fire. I stared at her, the rules screaming in the back of my throat. No staying. No names. I thought of my daughter's bed upstairs, the sheets still tucked tight and cold for 3 years. I thought of the silence I had cultivated like a garden. "I won't touch anything," she whispered, her gaze drifting toward the orange glow behind me. "I won't stay long." She paused, and her next words were a hammer blow. "If I sit down out here, I won't get up again." It wasn't a plea. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the hollow clarity of the dying. I had turned away strong men and weeping mothers, but there was a gravity to her, a weight of truth that I couldn't push back against. I stepped aside, my hand trembling on the latch. "Kitchen only," I said, my voice sounding like gravel in a tin cup. "No beds." She nodded once, a sharp, bird-like movement, and stepped over the threshold. The heat hit her like a physical blow. I saw her shoulders sag, the tension that had been holding her upright suddenly dissolving. She didn't move toward the center of the room. She stayed by the door, aware of the space she occupied, careful not to presume. I pulled a heavy oak chair closer to the hearth and tipped it toward her with the toe of my boot. "Sit," I commanded. She sank into the chair slowly, her movements jerky and stiff. She extended her hands toward the flames, fingers swollen, knuckles purpled. She didn't sigh. She didn't close her eyes. She just watched the fire with a predatory intensity, as if she expected the flames to vanish if she looked away. I filled a tin cup with warm water from the kettle and slid it across the scarred wooden table. Slow, I warned. She drank with a terrifying focus, her throat working in rhythmic gulps. When she finished, she set the cup down with both hands, placing it precisely on the table as if it were an artifact of great value. The silence that followed was different than the silence I lived with. It wasn't empty. It was pressurized. I went back to my chair and picked up my rasp. The rhythmic scrape, scrape, scrape of the wood, the only bridge between us. Outside, the snow continued its relentless, confident descent. After a long while, I noticed her eyes moving. She wasn't searching for things to steal. She was cataloging the room. She saw the dust on the unused bar, the stack of folded cots against the wall, the way I kept my tools arranged by height. She saw the ghost of the man I used to be. "You won't find a bed here," I said, not looking up from the chair leg. "I know," she replied. Her voice was steadier now, the warmth beginning to thaw the ice in her chest. "Time in the last stop in doesn't move like it does in the world of men. It stretches and thins." I added a log to the fire, more wood than was strictly necessary, and she tracked the movement of my hands. "You don't have to," she said. I know. She didn't thank me. I liked her better for it. Gratitude is often just a mask for debt, and we both knew we were beyond such trivialities. As the light outside transitioned from the pale white of day to the bruised gray of a mountain evening, I stood to latch the shutters. I felt her eyes on my back. When I turned, she was still there, the firelight dancing in her dark pupils. "They told me winter would decide," she said suddenly. The words felt heavy, like stones dropped into a deep well. I paused, my hand on the shutter latch. Who did? My people. That was all she offered. And in this country, that was a history book's worth of information. It meant a village, a community, a tribe that had looked at her and decided she was the price they were willing to pay for their own comfort. It meant she was an exile. I nodded, acknowledging the weight of it. Night fell with the finality of a guillotine. I lit a single lamp, a small pool of amber in the growing shadows. The inn felt smaller now, the walls leaning in, the fire our only defense against the infinite dark outside. "You should have woken me," I said the next morning, realizing I had drifted off in my chair. She hadn't moved. She was sitting exactly as I'd left her, the blanket I'd draped over her shoulders now serving as a shield. She looked at me, and I realized with a jolt of recognition that she hadn't slept at all. She had spent the night standing guard over her own life. "The fire was enough," she said. I set water to warm, my back to her. This was the ritual of the inn, the preparation of heat, the avoidance of eye contact. But the ritual was broken. I could feel her presence, a living, breathing truth in a house built on silence. By midday, the world outside began to stir. I saw a trader pass through the window, a man named Miller, who usually stopped to grumble about the price of grain. This time, he didn't even slow down. He just looked at the chimney, saw the smoke, and kept riding. But he looked. I felt the shift then. The moment when a secret stops being a secret and starts being a target. She felt it too. She moved to the edges of the room, avoiding the light from the windows. She wasn't hiding out of fear. She was choosing her ground. "People will talk," I told her, as I sharpened a knife at the table. "They always do," she answered. "Talk is how they convince themselves they're right." And, late in the afternoon, a man stopped in the yard. He didn't come in. He stood by the hitching post, adjusting his gloves, staring at my sign as if he were reading a map to a place he shouldn't be. When I stepped out onto the porch, the cold bit at my ears, but I didn't flinch. "Didn't know anyone kept this place open in winter, Hale," he said. He was a local, a man with a thin smile and eyes that were always calculating the distance to the next advantage. "Somebody does," I replied. His eyes slid past me, trying to peer into the dim interior of the kitchen. "Anyone staying?" Heard a rumor on the trail. "No beds," I said, my voice as flat as the horizon. He nodded slowly, his smile widening just a fraction. "I didn't ask about beds, Thomas. I asked if anyone was here." I held his gaze. I let the silence grow until it was a physical barrier between us. I thought of the barefoot woman inside, and I thought of my daughter, and I felt a cold anger begin to burn a different kind of fire. "The road is open," I said. "Use it." He tipped his hat, the gesture a mockery of respect, and rode away. When I went back inside, she was standing by the hearth, the rag in her hand frozen mid-wipe. She had been cleaning the stones. "They're starting to look," I said. "Yes, I can leave before dark," she offered. It wasn't a threat or a plea. It was a gift. She was giving me my silence back. She was giving me my rules. I looked at the folded cots. I looked at the door I had kept unbarred for 3 years because I didn't care who came in. And then, I looked at her red-handed, iron-willed, and refusing to disappear. "No," I said. "Not yet." I saw her shoulders loosen, just a fraction. A single knot in a long rope being eased. "I won't cause trouble for you," she whispered. "I know," I said. "That's the problem. Trouble is already here. It's been here a long time. It's just finally found someone to talk to." I went to the door and, for the first time since the winter my daughter died, I slid the heavy iron bolt into place. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot. She looked at the door, then at me. "That changes things," she said. "Yes," I agreed, feeling the weight of the fire in my chest. "It does." I'm down. The iron bolt felt cold against my palm, a physical anchor in a world that was rapidly drifting toward a storm. I didn't turn around immediately. I stayed there, forehead pressed against the rough-hewn timber of the door, listening to the wind pick up. It was a low, mournful whistle, the kind that sounds like the earth itself is grieving. Behind me, the fire popped. A pocket of sap in the pine log exploded, a small sound that seemed as loud as a cannon in the stifling quiet of the inn. "They won't just ride away, Thomas," Mara said. Her use of my name startled me. I hadn't given it to her, but names have a way of leaking out of the floorboards in a place like this. I turned. She was sitting on the edge of the cot now, her hands clasped so tightly, her knuckles were white. The raw, frozen skin of her feet was beginning to peel, a grisly testament to the distance she'd covered. "I know," I said. "Men like that, the ones who smile while they're measuring your grave, they don't have anywhere else to be." I walked to the cupboard and pulled out a bottle of rye I'd been saving for a night I didn't want to remember. I poured 2 fingers into a glass and sat across from her. I didn't offer her a drink. She looked like she needed her wits, and I needed mine. "Tell me," I said, "what is the noise you made? What truth is worth walking barefoot through a mountain pass for?" Mara looked at the fire, and for a moment, her face softened, the lines of exhaustion giving way to a profound, ancient sadness. "In my town down in the valley, where the big timber is, there was a sickness," she began. Her voice was steady, but there was a tremor underneath, like a bridge vibrating before it collapses. Or that's what the council called it. A wasting of the lungs. 6 men died in the mills in 3 months. Then the children started coughing. She looked up at me, her dark eyes piercing. "It wasn't a sickness, Thomas. It was the runoff. The new tanning chemicals the mill owners were dumping into the creek to save a few cents on the dollar. I saw the barrels. I saw the seals. My husband. He worked the late shift. He found the records. I leaned back, the rye burning a slow trail down my throat. I knew that story. Not that specific one, but the shape of it. It was the story of power protecting itself. He tried to take it to the sheriff," she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He never made it to the station. They said his heart gave out. A man of 32, strong as an ox, just stopped. They buried him before I could even see the body. They told me to be quiet. They said the mill provided the bread on our tables, and that a good widow doesn't bite the hand that feeds her." "But you bit," I said. "I didn't just bite," she said, a flash of fierce pride lighting up her face. I screamed. I stood in the square and told every mother whose child was coughing blood exactly what was in the water. I told them the sickness had a name, and that name was greed. She looked at the door, the iron bolt I'd just thrown. "That's why they sent them. Not to bring me back, to make the noise stop. They told the town I'd gone mad with grief, that I was a danger to the public peace. They gave me a choice. Walk into the mountains and let winter decide my fate, or stay and face a hearing I would never walk out of. And you chose the mountain," I murmured. I chose to exist, she corrected. Even if it was only for one more day. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of her words. I looked at my hands, calloused, scarred, the hands of a man who had spent 3 years trying to build a wall out of silence. I had thought I was protecting myself from the world. But as I looked at Mara, I realized I had just been waiting. The sound came then. It wasn't a knock. It was the rhythmic, heavy thud of horses' hooves on the frozen ground of the yard. Multiple horses. I stood up, my old joints protesting, and moved to the window. 2 men. I recognized the older one from the afternoon, the one with the calculated smile. Beside him was a younger man, thick-necked and restless, his hand resting too comfortably on the pommel of his saddle. They didn't dismount. They sat there in the pale moonlight, 2 shadows against the white. "Thomas Hale," the older one called out. His voice was pleasant, almost neighborly. "We know you're in there. And we know she's in there." I looked at Mara. She hadn't moved, but her breathing had changed. It was shallow, sharp. "Stay back from the light," I whispered to her. I went to the door, but I didn't open it. I spoke through the wood. "The inn is closed for the season. Move on." "Now, Thomas, don't be like that," the voice came back. "We've had a long ride. My friend here is cold, and we've got a bit of business to settle with your guest. We're not looking for trouble with a man of your standing. Just hand over the woman, and we'll be gone before the snow starts again." "I don't have a guest," I said, my voice echoing the lies I'd told myself for years. "I have a person by my fire. And in this house, the fire belongs to whoever is sitting by it." There was a long pause. I could hear the younger man's horse shifting, the creak of leather. "You're a hard man to help, Thomas," the older man said, his tone losing its warmth. "We know about your daughter. We know you've been hollowed out by this place. Don't let a stranger be the reason you lose what's left. She's a liar and a thief. She's stirred up a nest of hornets that you don't want in your kitchen." I felt Mara move behind me. She was standing just a few feet away, her eyes fixed on the door. "He's right about one thing," she whispered to me. "I am a stranger." I didn't look at her. I kept my eyes on the door. "My daughter died in that room upstairs," I said, my voice cracking for the first time. "She died because I followed the rules. I waited for the doctor the council sent. I gave her the medicine they provided. I stayed quiet, and I trusted the proper way of things." I gripped the handle of the bolt. "I'm done with the proper way of things," I yelled toward the yard. "She stays. If you want her, you'll have to come through the fire." The response was immediate. The younger man dismounted, his boots hitting the porch with a heavy thud. He didn't knock. He kicked the door. The last stop in was old, but it was built of mountain cedar and grit. The door groaned, but the bolt held. "One night, Hale," the older man shouted from his horse. "That's all you're getting. We'll be in the barn. We'll be watching. If she steps a foot outside, or if you try to slip her out the back, this whole place goes up. Do you understand? The fire you're so fond of it can burn a house down just as easily as it warms a room." I heard them leading their horses toward the stable. The yard went quiet again. But it was a jagged, ugly quiet. I turned back to the room. Mara was looking at me, her expression unreadable. "You just traded your life for a story," she said. "No," I said, walking back to the hearth and picking up a fresh log. "I traded a grave for an inn. There's a difference." I laid the wood on the coals. I didn't do it out of habit this time. I did it with intention. Every spark that flew up the chimney was a middle finger to the men in the barn. "They'll wait for dawn," I said, sitting back down. "Men like that don't like to do their killing in the dark if they can help it. It's too easy to miss. They'll wait for the light so they can be sure." "Then we have 6 hours," Mara said. "No," I replied, looking at the staircase that led to the silent rooms above. "We have a lifetime. It just happens to be packed into 6 hours." I looked at her. Really looked at her, and saw the terror she'd been masking with iron. She was trembling not from the cold, but from the sudden, terrifying reality that someone was standing in front of her. "Sleep," I said. "I'll watch the door." "I can't sleep," she whispered. "Then tell me more," I said. "Tell me about the creek. Tell me about the children. If I'm going to die for a noise, I want to know the melody." And so, through the deepest part of the winter night, she talked. She told me about the way the water used to look before the mills came. She told me about her husband's laugh and the way the town used to feel like a home instead of a cage. I listened, and for the first time in 3 years, the last stop in didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like a fortress, but outside, the snow had stopped. The clouds were breaking, revealing a cold, indifferent moon, and in the barn, the lantern light flickered, a reminder that the sun was coming, and it was bringing the reckoning with it. The moon hung like a jagged piece of bone over the ridge, casting long, distorted shadows across the floorboards. I sat by the hearth, my shotgun resting across my knees, watching the door. Mara had finally succumbed to exhaustion, her head lolling against the back of the oak chair, her breathing heavy and ragged. I didn't have her luxury. My mind was a frantic map of the last stop in. The men in the barn, led by the one with the polite voice and the soul of a vulture, expected me to cower until dawn. They expected a broken old man to sit by a dying fire and wait for the inevitable. They didn't realize that I knew every creak, every hollow, and every secret rot of this building. I had built half of it myself, and the other half I had disassembled and reassembled a dozen times in my dreams. I stood up, my joints singing a chorus of pain, and moved toward the back of the kitchen. "Thomas?" Mara's voice was sharp, instantly awake. She hadn't moved her head, but her eyes were wide, tracking me in the shadows. "Stay quiet," I whispered, "and put your shoes back on. I don't care if they hurt. Wrap them in the rags, but you need to be able to run." "Where?" she asked, standing up. "They're watching the front and the back. They said they'd burn it down." "Let them try," I grunted. I pulled back the heavy rug near the pantry. Beneath it lay a trapdoor, flush with the floor, the wood scarred and dark. This wasn't a cellar for root vegetables or ale. When this inn was first built long before the trails were safe, it had served as a way station for those who needed to disappear. I pried the door open. A draft of damp, earthy air hit my face. "The cellar leads to a drainage tunnel," I explained, my voice low. "It runs 40 yards out, under the road, and exits into the dry creek bed behind the old smokehouse. It's narrow, and it'll be wet, but it's a blind spot." "And you?" she asked, her eyes searching mine. "You're coming?" I looked at the staircase. I thought of the room upstairs, the one I hadn't opened in months. Then I looked at the fireplace. "I'm going to give them exactly what they asked for," I said. "I'm going to give them the fire." I began to move with a purpose I hadn't felt in years. I gathered the lamp oil from the pantry, 3 heavy jugs of it. I moved to the front room and began dousing the curtains, the dry pine tables, the stack of unused cots. The smell was sharp, chemical, and final. "What are you doing?" Mara whispered, her voice trembling. "This is your home." "No," I said, tipping a chair over. "This is a memory. And memories burn." I reached into the wood box and pulled out a handful of mountain candles, heavy sticks of fat wood soaked in resin. I tied them together with twine and wedged them into the rafters above the front door. "I'm setting a trap," I said. "When they see smoke, they'll think we're trapped. They'll come for the kill. They'll expect us to be huddled in the kitchen. When they burst through that door, I want the front room to be an oven." I looked at the clock on the mantel. 2 hours until the sun touched the peaks. "Go down," I commanded, pointing to the trapdoor. "There's a lantern at the bottom. Don't light it until you're 10 yards in. Wait for me at the exit by the smokehouse. If I'm not there when the roof goes, you keep moving north toward the pass. There's a trapper's cabin 5 miles up. He's a friend. Thomas, don't do this. Come now." I gripped her shoulder. My hand was shaking, but my gaze was steady. "Mara, you said the truth makes noise. Well, I spent 3 years being silent. It's time I made a little noise of my own. Now, go." She looked at me for a long heartbeat, then disappeared into the dark maw of the floor. I was alone. I moved through the inn like a ghost. I rigged the back door with a heavy crossbar that looked flimsy from the outside but would hold against a battering ram. I piled the rest of the firewood against the kitchen wall, creating a fuse that would lead from the front room to the pantry. Then, I went upstairs. I walked into my daughter's room. It was cold, bitterly, bone-achingly cold. I picked up the small wooden doll resting on the quilt. I tucked it into my coat. "I'm sorry, Sarah," I whispered to the empty air. "But I can't stay in the graveyard anymore." I went back down. I stood by the hearth and took a long, burning ember from the fire with a pair of iron tongs. I walked to the front door. I could hear them outside, the low murmur of voices, the clink of a bit. They were getting restless. The younger one was probably checking the cylinder of his revolver, eager to prove himself. "Hey!" I shouted through the door. "I've thought it over. I'm coming out. But the girl stays. That's the deal. The deal is whatever we say it is, Hale," the younger man shouted back. "Open the door, and maybe we won't clip your ears." I smiled. It was a cold, jagged thing. "Come and get me then," I said. I dropped the ember into the pool of oil beneath the front window. Whoosh! The flame didn't struggle. It roared. The oil-soaked curtains vanished in a flash of orange, and the heat slapped me in the face like a physical hand. The fire climbed the walls, devouring the dry cedar, racing toward the resin-soaked rafters I'd prepared. I didn't wait to see them react. I ran for the kitchen. I heard the front door being kicked. Once. Twice. Then a heavy thud as they threw their shoulders against it. "It's on fire!" The old fool set the place on fire. I dived into the trapdoor and pulled it shut above me just as the kitchen window shattered from the heat. The tunnel was a nightmare of mud and freezing water. I crawled on my hands and knees, the doll in my pocket pressing against my ribs. Above me, I could hear the muffled sounds of chaos, the screaming of horses, the frantic shouts of men who had realized too late that the broken old man had teeth. The ceiling of the tunnel vibrated. The inn was collapsing. I felt a momentary pang, the loss of the rafters that had sheltered me, but it was drowned out by a surge of adrenaline. I reached the end of the tunnel, a narrow opening choked with dead brush and snow. I pushed through, gasping as the freezing air hit my lungs. I was behind the smokehouse. Across the yard, the last stop in was a pillar of fire against the pre-dawn sky. It was beautiful, in a terrible, cleansing way. The heat was so intense that the snow for 20 yards around was turning into a thick, white mist. I saw them. The two men were backing away from the porch, their clothes singed, their faces masks of soot and fury. The younger man was clutching his arm. He'd been caught by the initial blast. Their horses had bolted, disappearing into the woods. "Where are they?" The older man screamed, his polite veneer completely gone. "They couldn't have stayed in there." He turned, his eyes searching the mist. He looked right toward the smokehouse. A hand reached out from the shadows and pulled me back. It was Mara. She was huddled in the lee of the stone wall, her face pale, her eyes reflecting the inferno. "We have to go," she whispered. "Now, while they're blinded by the light." "Wait," I said. I raised my shotgun. I didn't aim at the men. I aimed at the heavy, ice-covered water trough near the barn. Boom. The lead shot shattered the frozen wood, and the remaining water hissed as it spilled into the mud. It was a distraction. A noise in the dark. Both men spun toward the sound, their guns drawn, firing wildly into the mist where they thought I was. "Now," I said. We turned and ran. Not toward the road, but upward, into the rocks, following a trail that only a man who had hunted these peaks for 30 years could find. We climbed until my lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. When we finally reached the first ridge, I stopped and looked back. The last stop in was a glowing coal in the palm of the valley. The fire was dying down now, the heavy beams having fallen in on themselves. There was no sign of the men. They were down there in the dark, searching the ashes of a life I no longer owned. Mara stood beside me, her breath coming in long, white plumes. She looked at the fire, then she looked at me. She reached out and touched the sleeve of my coat. "You burned it all," she said. "No," I said, reaching into my pocket and feeling the smooth wood of Sarah's doll. "I just cleared the ground." The sun began to bleed over the eastern peaks, staining the snow a deep, bruised purple. The wind was still cold, and the path ahead was steep and unforgiving. "We're not safe yet," she reminded me. "I know," I said, turning my back on the valley. "But for the first time in a long time, I'm not waiting for winter to win." I adjusted my grip on the shotgun and looked toward the north. "Come on," I said. "We've got a lot of noise left to make." The sun didn't rise so much as the world simply turned a paler shade of gray. We were 3 miles above the tree line now, where the oxygen was thin, and the wind had a razor's edge that sliced through wool and skin alike. My legs felt like leaden weights, and every breath was a battle. Behind us, the valley was swallowed by a sea of mist, the funeral pyre of the inn, nothing more than a memory. But the vulture was still coming. I could feel him. It wasn't a sound, it was the instinct of a man who had spent his life watching the shadows. He had survived the fire, and he had survived the trek. He was a man driven by a different kind of fuel, the need to restore the silence that Mara had broken. "He's there," Mara whispered, pointing back toward a cluster of jagged rocks. A dark shape moved slow, methodical, relentless. It was the older man. He was alone now. The younger one had likely succumbed to the cold or his wounds, but the older one was the dangerous one. He was the one who understood that the truth was a disease that had to be cauterized. "Go to the cabin," I told Mara, handing her the small wooden doll. "It's just over that rise. If you see a plume of smoke, that's Silas. He'll keep you hidden." "I'm not leaving you, Thomas," she said, her eyes fierce. "You aren't leaving me. You're carrying the noise," I replied, my voice raspy. "I'm the wall. That's what I've always been. Now, go." I didn't wait for her to argue. I turned back toward the trail and sank into the snow behind a shelf of granite. I checked my shotgun. One shell left. In this wind, at this range, it was a gamble I couldn't afford to lose. I waited. The cold began to settle into my joints, a familiar, numbing embrace. I watched the shape get closer. He wasn't rushing. He knew the mountain would do half his work for him. When he was 50 yards away, he stopped. He didn't seek cover. He stood in the middle of the trail, his coat flapping like the wings of the bird he was named for. "Hail!" he called out. His voice was thinner now, eroded by the altitude, but the arrogance was still there. "You've burned your house and ruined your life for a woman who won't remember your name in a year. Is this the ending you wanted?" I didn't answer. I tracked him through the sights, the world narrowing down to the space between his ribs. "She's a carrier of chaos, Thomas," he shouted. "The world needs order. It needs the mills. It needs the silence. You're fighting for a ghost. I'm fighting for the sound of the creek," I muttered to myself. He reached into his coat, not for a gun, but for a flask. He took a slow, deliberate drink. "I'll give you one chance. Step aside. Let me finish what the council started, and I'll tell them you died a hero trying to save your inn." I stood up then. I didn't hide. I stood on the spine of the mountain, the wind howling around us like a choir of the damned. "The last stop in is gone," I yelled back. "And I'm not Thomas Hale the innkeeper anymore." I fired. The roar of the shotgun was swallowed by the wind, but the lead found its mark. The vulture didn't fall immediately. He staggered, his hand clutching his chest, a look of profound surprise on his face. He looked down at the red stain spreading across his fine coat, then back at me. He tried to raise his own pistol, but his fingers were frozen. He sank to his knees. The snow around him began to turn a brilliant, violent crimson. "The noise," he wheezed, his head sagging. "It never stops." He fell forward into the drift. The mountain didn't roar. It didn't cheer. It simply waited for the snow to cover him. I stood there for a long time, my lungs burning, the empty shotgun heavy in my hands. I looked back toward the ridge. Mara was standing there, a silhouette against the rising sun. She hadn't gone to the cabin. She had waited to see if the wall would hold. I started walking toward her. It was the hardest mile I've ever traveled. My heart felt like it was stuttering, a candle flickering in a draft. When I reached her, she didn't say a word. She just reached out and took my arm, pulling it over her shoulder, sharing her strength with a man who had finally run out of his own. We reached Silas's cabin as the sun fully broke over the horizon. It was a small, sturdy place, built of timber that had seen 100 winters, and one every time. Silas was there, standing on the porch, a rifle in his hand, and a question in his eyes. "Thomas?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "What have you brought to my door?" "A guest," I said, my voice finally breaking. "She's staying the night." Silas looked at the soot on my face, the raw skin on Mara's feet, and the way we leaned on each other. He stepped aside and opened the door. Inside, a fire was already burning. It wasn't a practical fire, or a defiant fire, or a trap. It was just a fire. It was warm. It was bright. And it didn't care about the rules of the world below. I sat in a chair by the hearth and let Mara wrap a warm blanket around my shoulders. She sat on the floor beside me, her back against my knees, her eyes fixed on the flames. We didn't talk about the inn. We didn't talk about the men in the snow. I reached into my pocket and pulled out Sarah's doll. I handed it to Mara. She took it gently, her fingers tracing the carved wood. "What happens now?" she asked. I looked at the fire. I thought of the winters I had spent counting, and the winters I had spent hiding. I thought of the road that was still out there, waiting for us to find it again. "Now," I said, "we wait for the melt. And then we go down the other side of the mountain. I hear there's a town 3 days west that's been too quiet for too long." She smiled, a real smile this time, one that reached her eyes. "I think I'd like to make some noise there," she said. I leaned back and closed my eyes. For the first time in 3 years, the cold didn't feel like an enemy. It was just the weather. The fire was steady. The door was unbarred, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving. I was home.